When you think about care or caring relationships, what immediately springs to your mind? Maybe you thought about a mother caring for a child, or perhaps you thought about the love that adults give each other. You may have thought about caring for an elderly parent. My name is Professor Sarah Crafter, and in my presentation I'm actually going to talk about the care that children provide others, both other adults and other children, particularly in the context of migration. Let me start by telling you a story from my own research. This was an incident told to me by a young woman called Talia. So Talia had arrived in the country with her mother when she was about 12 years old. She spoke Arabic and she spoke Spanish, but she was still learning English. She'd been in the country about 3 or 4 months. And in their flat, there was a problem with the toilet. Because her and her mother lived in social housing, she had to go to the local authority to organise getting it fixed. Talia told me that she spoke to this Romanian guy, and while she was trying to explain about the problem with the toilet, he said to her, "Sorry, I don't want to talk to you because you don't make sense." Talia felt like what he was really saying was, "I don't want to talk to you because you don't speak English." She said she asked him not to be rude, but that he could do anything he wanted with her. She asked to speak to somebody else, but he told her to go and threatened to call the police. All this time, her mother was asking her what was happening, and she just said, "I'm dealing with the problem." In the end, she spoke to a security guard, and he arranged for her and her mother to speak to someone else. But Talia told me 2 further really interesting things. She said, "I felt bad. I'm not, like sometimes I might be rude to people my age, but I'm not rude to adults, no way. So obviously he was being rude to me, thinking he could do anything he wanted with me, but no, because he couldn't speak English either. So I was trying to defend me and my mum, and at the same time, I didn't want my mum to know that something was wrong." When she later told her mum what had happened, her mother told her that they should have just left, but Talia said she didn't want to be someone who was always hiding. She wanted to be someone who dealt with problems. She said, "I knew my mum's not the person who deals with problems. She just wants to leave and leave. You cannot be like that in life the whole time, just hiding. You have to stand up for yourself." I use this example because it shows the complex ways that children of migration play an important role in the settlement of their families and their friends into a new country. But Talia's example also shows that it's not always easy for any of those involved. Firstly, she has to navigate this new language. And since children often learn the language faster than their family members, they end up being both linguistic and cultural mediators between the private world of their family and the public world of institutions like the local authority. In the academic research and literature, this is often called child language brokering. So this idea of translating and interpreting for family members, for peers, the local community. Secondly, she also faces this hostile adult who's in a position of authority. She needs something from this adult. She needs help for her and her mother. Thirdly, she's very conscious that her age stands against her. She doesn't like to be rude to an adult, but at the same time, she said, "He can do whatever he wants with me." And finally, she sees herself as protecting her mother in this altercation. And although her mother was probably right, maybe it should have been better that they leave. For Talia, this could be framed as a form of protecting her mother, which could be seen as a kind of caring practice. So what I want to talk about in my presentation is this important intersection that we saw through Talia's story of migration, childhood, and care. So I'm going to draw on two examples from my own research that I did in collaboration with colleagues. The first is about child language brokers like Talia, who translate and interpret for family members, peers, and the local community. The other example that I will be drawing on is research that explores the lives of separated child migrants or unaccompanied minors, which is the more familiar term. So these are young people under the age of 18 years who travel and undertake migration journeys without kin. In our research for the Children Caring on the Move project, myself and my colleagues have been interested in exploring this intersection of migration, care, and childhood, and what it might mean for separated child migrants' care of each other, especially as they navigate asylum and welfare systems as it happens in England, which is the context of my research. So this raises a question. Why is it important to explore migration, childhood, and care? Let's take migration first. The literature on migration has shown that children have been on the move for centuries, either with family or in the absence of family. But as Marjorie or Alana pointed out, in the past, they have often been seen as little more than the luggage that parents bring along with them on their migration journeys. But the last decade or so has really shone more of a spotlight on the role that children play themselves in the migration process, not just on the journey, but the kind of resource they are to families or to each other in helping to settle into the new context. So then what about childhood? Well, as has been previously pointed out, immigrant childhoods are not necessarily framed in the same way as citizen childhoods. Immigrant childhoods shine a spotlight on how heterogeneous and diverse children's experiences of growing up might be. And somewhat ironically, children are most noticed when they step outside or transgress the boundaries of how childhood and children should be seen and should behave. So looking at childhood through a critical psychological lens, which is what I want to do in this presentation, sheds a light on the way in which some childhoods are seen as transgressing what might be considered the normal childhood, which is seen as a time of dependence, of vulnerability, and indeed staying close to the familial home. Often, traditional psychology has represented children's development as this steady transition to adulthood and independence, which is carefully monitored by the adults around them. But as people like Robert Weisskirch have pointed out, migration to a new country can throw up not previously experienced challenges that might require new role distributions within the families, so that children are taking on more adult-like responsibilities, helping their parents, like Talia did with her mother, helping by translating and interpreting. They are sometimes found to help with mortgage applications, visit to the banks, or in the case of separated child migrants, without kin, they have to attempt to engage an immigration lawyer, help get their asylum case through, and so on. So examining childhood through the lens of migration asks us to question what a normative childhood might look like. And then that brings us to care. When we include care in the mix, we can see that both popular perceptions and academic representations of the care by children is normally associated with adulthood, or children giving care is seen as unusual or a transgression from the norm, sometimes a danger to them, perhaps even treated with hostility or suspicion. Arguably, one of the reasons this has been the case is because powerful discourses and ideas reflected in the field of psychology has viewed care in narrow form. So mainly as the care that a parent provides a child. Or if the child doesn't have kin, the care is provided by the state, perhaps in the form of a social worker. In other words, historically, children have been positioned in that category of being cared for. But when psychology is open to viewing childhood through a critical lens, exploring the rich multidimensionality of children's lives and the contribution they can make to our social lives, we can see they also play a significant role in caring for others. So, what are the complexities raised by looking at migration, childhood and care through the example of children who migrate? And in my case, namely child language brokers and separated child migrants. So I'm going to begin by drawing on some of my child language brokering research. And in this particular study, we were very interested in exploring how young people mediated or navigated difficult interactions. So we have to bear in mind that young people from migrant backgrounds are often contending with difficult or hostile immigration contexts. So as language brokers, young people are really there, translating and interpreting, and are at the forefront of interactions where sometimes their families are not being treated well or properly. So we interviewed 29 young people. They were aged between 13 and 16 years old. And we used short vignette stories as a stimulus to talk about their own views and experiences and how they would navigate or tackle a difficult translating and interpreting situation. So these short vignettes were all adapted from real examples from the literature. So for example, there was one vignette which was about Gabriella and her father. And they also had to go to the housing office because they needed the heating fixed. They'd been before and nothing had been done. So during this exchange, Gabriella's father started to get angry and asked Gabriella to call the housing officer a useless idiot. In the other vignette, this was a story about Amrit. Amrit was at the supermarket and he was shopping with his mother for a very particular ingredient. They were going to use it for his grandfather's birthday meal, but he couldn't find the words to translate this into English and he struggled to describe it. And the shop person became impatient with him, but used an impatient tone of voice, and Amrit's mother asked him what was being said. Now, one of our key findings from this study is that context really matters. And that sounds rather strange to say, because of course context matters. But language brokering research that has taken a very traditional psychological approach has tended to look at associations between child language brokering and other psychological phenomena, maybe sometimes stress or anxiety, depression, associations with risky behaviour, substance and alcohol abuse, and so on. There's also been research that looks at more positive associations, such as pro-social behaviour, empathetic concern, perspective taking. And these studies are really important and they're very insightful and useful, but they tend to exclude the important role of context in language brokering. Because language brokering is really a very audibly visible marker of cultural difference in the public sphere. And so it can amplify, we argue, tensions, inequalities, and really bring to the fore for the young people experiences of racialized microaggressions, everyday acts of racism. And we certainly found that in our research. So beginning with Janina was responding to the vignette of Amrit, the story of the boy in the supermarket who encounters the impatient shop person. And she described a very similar experience in the supermarket when asking to find help finding a product. She told me, yeah, they tried to get rid of me because when I tried to describe it very detailed things, so it's hard for them to understand. She then added, they look at me like I fell from the moon, and like I'm speaking an alien language, and it's really awkward for me. And then my mother starts applying the pressure like, what did you say? What did you do? Tell me, tell me. So as well as feeling like an alien, her mother's intervention, perhaps resulting from a sense that the shopkeeper is not being nice to her daughter, adds pressure to Janina in the situation. And other respondents in our sample told us they also felt mistreated by these other adults who were in positions of authority. So there was an example from Rabiatu. She described how her and her mother went to the police station when she had had her laptop stolen. It was a brand new laptop and she'd got it for her birthday. And even though she had a receipt, she told us, they said they don't care and that it's probably not even my laptop, that I probably stole it, the box and the thing. Rabiatu went on to say, I think it had something to do with race. When we asked her what her mum had said to the police, she said she cursed them out and called them racist bastards. So, like many young people from minority backgrounds, our language brokers did experience these everyday racialized microaggressions, but they're afforded very little protection from them, and in part because as language brokers, they are the channel through which the language of racism is communicated. Another key finding from our study with the child language brokers was that caring through language brokering can lead to a range of emotional entanglements between the language broker, their parent, for whom they're translating, and the other adult in this situation. Many scholars within the care literature have talked about how care activities do involve this sense of emotional labour. And our young respondents expressed everything from pride to annoyance at having to give up their time to language broker for their families. But simultaneously, most of our language brokers also expressed a deep empathy, recognising the frustrations that their parents felt by not being able to communicate themselves. So these vignette stories that we gave our respondents all contained some kind of emotionally charged element, such as the father who said something rude in frustration or the impatient shopkeeper. In response, our respondents talked about how either the vignette character or they themselves should manage these emotion-laden situations. Most of our young people mentioned how important it was to stay calm, either in terms of their own experience or when discussing the vignette character. So Daria, for example, when talking about Gabriella, who went to the housing office with her father, how it really is important, even in light of her father's anger, to stay really calm. And he told me, they can't do nothing for you, they can't help you. So he recognised in order to achieve the goals or aims on behalf of your family, you needed to stay calm. And yes, he described how sometimes he felt angry inside, but he said, yeah, but it's okay, I will be calm and then I can translate. Circumstances, though, for these young people sometimes living in difficult housing situations, living in poor situations, made this incredibly difficult for the young people in our sample. But they also use some amazing strategies to adapt their responses in order to achieve what they needed to achieve. So sometimes they described trying to make themselves sound more mature. For example, speaking with an increasingly formal tone of voice in an attempt to be taken seriously. So one of our vignette interviewees, Edstera, described a discussion with her mother to set up a phone contract. So she was talking over the phone. And she started, she said, by being exceptionally polite, but recognizing the lack of support at the other end changed her tone. So she told me, I mean, at the beginning, I was really, really nice to him. I've never seen myself being that kind of nice to anyone. I was extremely nice to him, and he was just like ignoring me as much as he could. It was annoying, so I started to kind of ignore him too, just, you know, short sentences and stuff like this. So as the conversation progresses, as Tara begins to mimic or mirror the conversational style of the other adult in this situation. So she shifted from being really nice to using short sentences. I want to turn now to examples from our Children Caring on the Move project to explore this intersection between migration care and childhood. So this project, which I work on with colleagues, is about how separated child migrants or unaccompanied minors care for each other as they navigate the asylum and welfare rules in England following their migration to this new context. Now, care in this context is complex because these young people have often travelled on very precarious journeys in the absence of kin, but they also often travel with each other, and so they become carers for each other. Now, on the one hand, their child status means that when they arrive in a country like England, the state has a legal duty to protect them. But on the other hand, their immigration status means that they are subject to ever-tightening immigration controls, which has been described as the hostile immigration environment. For example, age assessments and long and complex asylum claims. So my colleagues and I wanted to explore what this might mean, both from the perspective of the separated child migrants themselves and their care of each other, but also adult stakeholders' perspectives on children's care of each other. So in both our pilot work and through our preliminary analysis for the Children Caring on the Move project, our work suggests that adults do recognise the importance of children's care for each other when we ask them directly. But it's also clear that this is often the first time they've really thought about its importance. They describe it, for example, in a sort of fleeting, quite ambiguous way. And we've described this in one of our papers as an absent presence, recognising it's important but not having really thought about it too deeply. So with some of our interviews with adults like social workers, charity advocates, immigration lawyers, border force, this has been the first time that they've really thought about children as carers for each other. And some of them acknowledged that there is a gap in understanding. So one social worker said to us, "Everybody always thinks they're the most important in these children's lives. I think there's a huge side of their lives that we don't know about." Others remarked on how their own roles and responsibilities, or this wider hostile immigration regime, made it challenging to even think about care, never mind children's care of each other. So as one border force worker told us, "I think we're just too focused on the immigration rules. we do forget that actually where children are involved, we're supposed to actually think about children and what's best for the child, regardless of what the quota system is and everything like that. And she described how there is a danger when you work in these contexts of not actually seeing the person. For some of our respondents, the focus on care was about stressing the country's generosity towards these young people, or stressing the robust procedures for safeguarding and care, to selling the sort of solid system of support, or suggesting that the young people should be grateful for the entitlements for migrants. There were others, though, who reflected more critically on these issues, particularly the systemic issues, and especially the major challenges facing frontline staff who are part of the statutory role to care, but simultaneously work in quite a hostile immigration situation. Somebody working in a charity told us, I think the first thing is the issue about your primary focus is meant to be on the welfare and needs of the young people. But there's a kind of challenge at the immigration issue and how you need to navigate this suspicion that they shouldn't be here at all, or this belief that they shouldn't be here at all, the suspicion that they're not here legally. So there's all of that, and having to comply with all the protocols about immigration and asylum claims. Others have focused on the way in which children's care for each other is not only something that happens and something that's important for them, but that it acts as a necessity for plugging the gap or the lack of state provision that these children should be given. So I want to bring in an example from Charlie. So Charlie set up his own charity project working with a particular community of migrant young people. And he was describing a situation where in the local community he worked with, if someone died, ordinarily the family would open up their home to receive guests during the mourning period. But in the absence of kin, separated child migrants don't have that. And yet, when a young man committed suicide, in the absence of family, that group of young people hosted each other in their homes during the mourning period. So he gave this as an example of a really nice form of care for each other, even though it was in really terrible circumstances. But equally, Charlie reflected and described the devastating impact that some of the immigration assessments can have on the young people's mental health. So when one of the members of their group was age assessed as an adult instead of a child, they were put in adult accommodation and their mental health deteriorated rapidly. His friends contacted Charlie to say that they were worried this young man was going to commit suicide. The friends brought him to the club and they were able to get support for him. But as Charlie told us, this is what happens when young people fall outside of the care system. It is their friends that provide that care for them. So Charlie had this difficult dichotomy that he wrestled with. He simultaneously felt that children's care of each other was important and extremely special, but he maintained that it shouldn't be a necessity because of the failures of the system to support vulnerable young people. Psychology continues to be dominated by ideas that frame childhood as this steady developmental transition to adulthood of dependency and innocence and vulnerability, and as a time when adults do the caring for young people. And those are very acceptable and important things. But it also means that we leave very little room for exploring what caring young people bring to the lives of others and indeed their own lives, especially in the context of migration when they're settling to new countries. So for my presentation, I've built on these two examples, child language brokers and the exploration into the lives of separated child migrants, to argue that psychology needs to be more open to perspectives from diverse childhoods, because these kinds of perspectives help us call into question our own assumptions about what does childhood mean, what does care mean, and what might both of those mean in the context of children who migrate. But taking the perspective of children is not always easy, because it asks us to interrogate our own feelings about the care of children and children's care of each other. So in view of these debates, I want to leave you with a final quote from Elora. And when asked what the housing officer would think of Gabriella, she told me, he just thinks like she's just under 16. She's just a kid. She shouldn't even be there. And he doesn't really get the importance. And when asked about her own experience of language brokering, she recalled a situation with her mother's landlord when they had a problem. And the landlord got annoyed. And she told me, I felt like I'm not a child anymore. I understand this thing. I'm mature enough to like have an opinion. But people treating kids like us in this age like this I don't find it right. Thank you.